On this programme, we have spent the past year talking about the mistakes that the government has made when it comes to the handling of the pandemic. We've talked about why we didn't lock down sooner, why we didn't shut the borders earlier, the crisis over PPE, why we didn't mask up more quickly, why there was a crisis with mass testing.
Care homes.
Why we didn't throw a protective shield around care homes. The second lockdown, what on earth was the delay and how did it lead to an even worse crisis in terms of the death toll, the failure of test and trace. And then, of course, most recently, why we were delayed in putting India on the red list and the confusion over travel advice. And yesterday, during 7 hours of explosive testimony, the man who was in the room when it happened, next to the Prime Minister, laid bare in ugly detail all of the mistakes that were made over every single one of these issues. So every time we have had a government minister on this programme batting away all of these criticisms...
Flatly refusing to acknowledge any of them, accept any of them...
And for 100 days refusing even to appear on this programme to answer questions about these problems, Dominic Cummings yesterday admitted that they had got so much wrong. And in a devastating day of testimony, said thousands of lives were lost, which did not need to be lost, and made an apology on behalf of the government. Well, let's go through some of those mistakes. The very first lockdown back at the beginning, well, it should have been much earlier, of course, last year, but he addressed the issue about the lockdown delay and talked about the fact that there was no plan. So let's have a listen to that. Lockdown delay, just see if we got that clip. Now, this doesn't just affect, obviously, tragically, those families who lost loved ones because of the delays and the problems. It also affects the families of those who survived, of course, and are dealing with long COVID. And Kate, I wonder whether, as you watched Dominic Cummings outline the litany of catastrophic mistakes and the delay, particularly in that first lockdown, if we'd locked down earlier, do you reflect on how things might have been different for you?
Well, I spent a lot of time reflecting on things that might have been different in lots of ways, both in the government's handling it and in the scientific advice, in the doctor's advice specifically to Derek. And it was definitely confused, wasn't it? So I think hindsight's a wonderful thing, but it doesn't mean to say we shouldn't address what went wrong. So obviously there were things that could have helped, we now know. But just as the doctors say, if we'd given Derek this particular medication at this point, that would have we now know would have definitely helped. But at the time, what we feared is it might have killed him. I am quite generous to the government generally about the fact that they were looking at a situation and thinking, what is going to be the most harmful? And if, as he said, Boris Johnson was more obsessed with the economy, maybe he genuinely believed that was the biggest risk. But it doesn't mean to say that things like planning for pandemic, planning for lockdown, that should have been something that was in place, not just from Boris Johnson's perspective or Matt Hancock's, but as a society, you know, that we haven't got those things in place.
I wonder as well, though, and Ramvir's joined us as well this morning, that how much of Dominic Cummings' credibility is in question here as well? Because a lot of the response that we're getting from viewers this morning is this is somebody that they don't trust. This is somebody who's been upset by the government and he just got old scores to settle. And actually, if all these things were going on, why didn't he make more of a sort of a noise about it at the time? why didn't he make a difference?
Well, we know that he doesn't like politicians of any calibre. He just doesn't like politicians. He doesn't like politics. He's interested in systems and he finds them all frustrating. He's a really deep thinker about how societies are run,
believe what he was saying yesterday.
Well, you know, and I think number 10 will be banking on the fact that the public will think that this is, the majority of it is political revenge of some kind. And there is a YouGov poll for the Times that says that 14% of people trust Dominic Cummings versus 38% trust Boris Johnson. Now, you know, they'll be hoping that in terms of the government and trust, which is obviously very low, and that's to be understood. But the fact that Dominic Cummings is somebody who we already saw do a press conference claiming that he went to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight and that he was allowed to use his instincts. So I think that that singularly did affect how people behaved afterwards, and I think people haven't forgotten that.
He's acknowledged that.
He's acknowledged that.
That affected behaviour. He's also said that there was a different reason for why he left his home at that point to go north. And that was, he said that they'd been receiving threats.
Right, yes. Well, and
at home, but he didn't want to divulge that.
He didn't want to divulge that. But I think that in terms of him personally, whether people think he's credible or not, I think a lot of what he said will have rung true to people, because the idea that test and trace was not being built properly in a proper way, and that when there was a vacuum of power, when Boris Johnson was ill with COVID, when Dominic Cummings was ill with COVID, that Matt Hancock used that opportunity to then announce, sort of without any regard to the facts, that there would be 100,000 tests per day, which that target was failed. And then his whole demeanour was all about pushing that test and trace system so that he would meet his target, that it was almost like a selfish and self-indulgent pursuit of a target over and above what was truly happening.
Well,